Our captain is very keen to see a great deal more down here, as indeed all of us are, I'm sure. So our intention is now to go towards the southwest.
We are in the year 1979. It's Wednesday, November 28th, somewhere over the Southern Ocean. Air New Zealand Flight 901, with 257 people on board, has been in the air for over 5 hours. Its destination, Antarctica. This is no ordinary flight, but a special sightseeing tour. The passengers are meant to experience and marvel at the last nearly untouched continent on Earth from above. The aircraft on this day is a 4-year-old Douglas DC-10, one of the most modern aircraft available at the time. At 13:32, the crew initiates the descent into the target area after receiving clearance from air traffic control to descend to 2,000 feet. The visibility and weather conditions are treacherous. In several loops, the crew descends from 17,800 feet to 1,500 feet in just 16 minutes. In the cabin, there is a buzz of activity as passengers hold their cameras to the windows, eager to capture the breathtaking scenery below. Then suddenly, an alarm sounds in the cockpit. Out of the blue, the crew finds themselves in a situation where they have only a few seconds to make the right choices. Choices that would mean the difference between life and death. In the end, at 13:49 and 50 seconds, the aircraft struck the slopes of the 12,400-foot Mount Erebus at 260 knots. None of the 257 people on board survived. An entire nation was left in shock, and aviation witnessed one of the worst tragedies in its history. How did this disaster happen? What exactly went wrong? And what impact would Flight 901 have? This is the story I want to tell you. A story not only shaped by mistakes and oversights, by unfortunate circumstances and ignorance, but also by integrity, honesty, and faith in justice. But to truly understand the events of November 28th, 1979, we must begin our journey a whole decade earlier. Antarctica, a continent of endless expanses of ice, snow, and majestic glaciers. An untouched, inhospitable world where not a single tree or shrub grows. An ancient landmass etched with ice millions of years old that continues to hold countless secrets. For centuries, this continent has captivated adventurers and explorers alike. Marked by eternal cold and fierce storms, Antarctica remained inaccessible and unexplored for a long time, shrouded in a sense of mystery. Yet humanity's insatiable drive to explore the unknown led brave souls on their perilous journeys toward the South Pole. In the past, it was a privilege reserved only for a few to experience this remote landscape by ship. With the advancement of technology, this began to change, especially in the 1970s, when modern new aircraft models entered the market. They were more powerful, more refined, and offered airlines new possibilities that had previously been unimaginable. This also brought more distant destinations into focus for airlines. As early as the late 1960s, Air New Zealand recognised the enormous potential of offering flights to Antarctica and making this adventure accessible to a wider audience. They viewed the untouched expanse of southern ice not only as an adventure, but also as a lucrative opportunity to offer exclusive sightseeing flights and fill their coffers with ticket sales. Initial planning and certifications already began in the late 1960s, with flights initially being considered using the Douglas DC-8. However, it quickly became apparent that the DC-8 was not ideal for such unique long-haul flights. Air New Zealand shelved the plan and waited for the perfect opportunity. That moment came in 1973 when the airline added its first modern Douglas DC-10 to the fleet. Larger, more powerful, and with significantly greater range and onboard possibilities, the DC-10 was the perfect aircraft for the planned Antarctic sightseeing flights. During the further planning phase, more DC-10 jets were added to Air New Zealand's fleet. On December 12, 1974, the aircraft registered Zulu Kilo, November Zulu Papa joined the fleet, a plane that soon entered regular service. What no one knew at the time, years later, that very aircraft would play a tragic leading role in the history of aviation. It was 1977 and the time had finally come. The first official sightseeing flight to Antarctica took off, accompanied by a major advertising campaign and public interest. The demand was overwhelming, a luxurious experience in the air, with champagne and first-class service for all passengers, and the unique view of the last unexplored corner of the Earth. The first Antarctic sightseeing flight was such a huge success that between 1977 and 1979, a total of 14 flights took place, almost all of them fully booked and highly sought after by passengers.
Absolutely fabulous, and I've never seen anything like it in my life.
Is it how you expected?
It's beyond anything I've ever dreamt of.
Oh, it's fantastic.
It's better than you expected?
I don't know what I expected. It's just beautiful.
On November 28, 1979, the 15th Antarctic flight was scheduled to take place. It was the last sightseeing flight planned for that year and bore the name TE-901. As the 257 passengers and crew of Flight 901 eagerly anticipated an exciting adventure, no one could have known that this would be their final journey. No one on board would ever return. It is just after 8 a.m. Wednesday, November 28, 1979. At Auckland Airport in New Zealand, Flight 901 is taxiing from the terminal towards the runway with a slight delay. The passengers are excited for the adventure of a lifetime, a scenic flight to Antarctica. The aircraft in service is a nearly 5-year-old Douglas DC-10, the fourth of its kind to join Air New Zealand's fleet. Since its introduction, it has formed the backbone of the airline's long-haul operations. The aircraft has a range of 10,500 kilometers and is configured to carry up to 243 passengers. On this day, it is carrying 237 passengers and 20 crew members, making the flight fully booked. In the cockpit today is a highly experienced crew. 45-year-old Captain Jim Collins has been with Air New Zealand and its predecessor, Tasman Empire Airlines, for almost 20 years. He has logged an impressive 11,000 flight hours, including 2,800 hours on the DC-10. At his side is First Officer Gregory Cassin, who has nearly 8,000 flight hours, with 1,300 hours on the DC-10. The third member of the cockpit crew is Flight Engineer Gordon Barrett Brooks, who, with over 10,000 flight hours and 3,000 hours on the DC-10, is the most experienced of the team on this aircraft type. The crew is exceptionally skilled and is regarded as meticulous, prudent, and thoroughly well prepared.
Before takeoff checklist. Ignition, continuous, radar, on, transponder, on, external light, set, flaps, 15, spoilers, retract, before takeoff checklist completed.
New Zealand 901, wind 320 degrees at 5 knots, runway 32 left, cleared for takeoff.
Cleared for takeoff, runway 32 left, New Zealand 901.
At 8:17 a.m., Flight 901 taxis onto the runway and begins its takeoff.
All right, on we go. New Zealand 891, turn the left heading 150, just to widen the base, descend to 3000. Take your notch. Check.
New Zealand 901, climb flight level 30, contact departure on 124.3.
The planned route of Flight 901 takes the aircraft first across mainland New Zealand before setting course for the remote Auckland Islands. From there, the journey continues over the Balleny Islands and Cape Hallett, heading directly toward McMurdo Sound in Antarctica. There, the aircraft is scheduled to fly around for a time, offering passengers breathtaking views of the icy expanse. A stopover in Christchurch is planned afterward to refuel and disembark some passengers. Finally, the aircraft will embark on its last leg, returning to Auckland in the evening, where the adventure will come to an end. After several hours in the air, Flight 901 reaches Cape Hallett at around 13:20, the last waypoint before the destination. The autopilot is steering the aircraft precisely along the flight path programmed into the onboard computer. The course leads to McMurdo Sound, a frozen bay situated between Ross Island and the vast Antarctic mainland. The terrain of this region is both breathtaking and treacherous. Towering mountains rise above Ross Island, where Scott Base and McMurdo Station are located, including Mount Terror, Mount Bird, and Mount Terra Nova. Yet none of these peaks are as imposing as Mount Erebus, an active volcano and, at 12,450 feet, the highest elevation in the area. Mount Erebus is not only of significant interest to local researchers as the southernmost active volcano on Earth, but is also one of the highlights for passengers on this journey. The frozen waters connect Ross Island to the Antarctic mainland, whose jagged coastline is marked by countless glaciers. Under the right conditions, this ice serves as a landing strip for supply flights to nearby research stations. In addition to the harsh terrain, the lack of infrastructure poses another major challenge. Navigational aids are sparse in Antarctica due to its remoteness. In most cases, crews rely entirely on the data transferred from the flight plan into the onboard computer. The first difficulties begin as Flight 901 approaches McMurdo Sound. The crew struggles to maintain stable communication with McMurdo Air Traffic Control. Communication is disrupted by unusually strong solar activity, which severely interferes with radio transmissions that day. The radio connection between the ground station and the DC-10 repeatedly breaks off, occupying the crew's attention more and more. Meanwhile, visibility conditions are deteriorating. A thick cloud layer at 3,500 feet, with additional layers above it, makes it nearly impossible to see the landscape. This adds further pressure on the crew. They want to deliver the promised adventure to the passengers. Even commentator Peter Mulgrew, who had been a speaker on previous flights, eventually runs out of things to say to the passengers. There is simply nothing to see. McMurdo Air Traffic Control informs the crew that visibility below the cloud layer is better, with an estimated range of 40 miles. Captain Collins spots a hole in the clouds and receives clearance at 13:32 to descend from their current altitude of 16,000 feet. He decides to initiate the descent. In 2 loops, Captain Collins maneuvers the DC-10 through the cloud layers. The aircraft eventually reaches 2,000 feet, where visibility significantly improves. Passengers can now see the first glimpses of the endless ice, and a sense of relief spreads throughout the cabin. However, not all crew members are convinced by the situation. Some express concern. Something doesn't feel right. They search for prominent landmarks that should be within sight, and easy to identify, but none can be found. The uncertainty in the cockpit grows. The crew begins discussing whether they should climb back to a higher altitude to reassess the situation. Yet, before a final decision can be made, the aircraft descends further, eventually reaching an altitude of 1,500 feet. At 13:49 and 44 seconds, the ground proximity warning system suddenly blares, warning the crew that they are dangerously close to the ground. 500 feet, the flight engineer shouts. 400 feet. Pull up, urges the first officer. The ground approaches rapidly. In a last effort, Captain Collins commands, "Go around power, please." The aircraft begins to pitch its nose upward to gain altitude, but it was too late. At 13:49 and 50 seconds, contact with Flight 901 was suddenly lost. Initially, no one was concerned due to the frequent communication issues earlier. However, when no radio contact could be re-established after 10 minutes, neither by the station in McMurdo nor by other aircraft in the vicinity, concern began to grow. Within the first 10 minutes, the first search teams were activated. Other planes and helicopters in the area also began searching the region where the DC-10 was initially suspected to be. Yet, despite all efforts, they found neither a trace of the aircraft nor its 257 occupants. Anxious hours passed, and no one knew what had happened to the plane or where it could be. In New Zealand, the distressing news spread rapidly. As uncertainty grew, so did numerous theories. Could the aircraft have made an emergency landing on the ice? Or had it ditched into the sea? Had the captain turned back due to technical problems and was still airborne? Yet the longer the time passed without any sign of Flight 901, the fainter the hope for a positive outcome became.
I can see there's still grounds of hope if they came down somewhere, well, even on the sea. We're doing our best. There's a Hercules, there are helicopters, another Starlifter. But the fact that worries me is that about an hour ago, on calculations, the fuel would have run out.
Relatives of the passengers waited anxiously at the airports in Christchurch and Auckland for any updates.
Mr. Davis, it's just about midnight. Is there any hope at all?
That is a question which is clearly one I'd like to answer in the positive, but I must say that the circumstances indicate that any chance that is a very, very slim one.
The following morning, the last glimmer of hope for a miracle, that the aircraft might somehow be found safe and sound, was finally extinguished.
Just wanted to tell you it's now coming through. Of course, and you probably, some of you have already ascertained that the wreckage has been sighted in the Antarctica on a location which indicates Mount Erebus and the McMurdo Sound area, and we have no other information other than helicopters are going in now and are likely to be at the site within about 20 minutes.
The time is 7 o'clock.
Good morning. From Morning Report, Jim Sullivan and Peter Sledmere here, and we're waking today to one of the grimmest reports since these programmes began. On the DC-10 crash in the Antarctic yesterday, the facts as we have them at the moment can be put as simply as this. An Air New Zealand DC-10 passenger plane on a scenic flight to and from the Antarctic was reported overdue yesterday evening, and at 4 minutes to 1 this morning it was announced that a United States Hercules had sighted wreckage on the slopes of Antarctica's active volcano Mount Erebus, which is within sight of Scott Base. There were no signs of survivors from the 257 people aboard. As can be appreciated, Radio New Zealand staff have been working through the night gathering in reports of what appears to be New Zealand's worst ever air disaster and possibly the worst calamity to befall the country.
All of New Zealand was in shock, and the news spread like wildfire across the front pages of the world's press. Everyone was asking the same question. How could something like this happen? Did the aircraft have a technical defect? Were there problems on board? In order to find answers to these questions, a comprehensive investigation was launched immediately by the Office of Air Accident Investigation. Given that another deadly crash involving a DC-10 had occurred in Chicago earlier that year, suspicions arose that the aircraft itself might have contributed to this disaster. In New Zealand, a team of specially trained police officers was assembled. Their mission: recovery of the human remains and securing crucial evidence. This dangerous mission became known as Operation Overdue. Within a few hours, the selected men were already on their way to Antarctica. As the aircraft carrying the search and rescue team approached McMurdo, the captain of the Hercules drew the men's attention to Mount Erebus. As they looked out through the round windows, the scale of the catastrophe slowly began to dawn on them. All that was left of what had been a massive 200-ton airliner less than 24 hours ago was a mark that looked like nothing more than a black cigarette smudge on the side of the mountain. Shortly after, as they landed on the icy runway at McMurdo and were briefed on the hazardous conditions, the first recovery teams reached the crash site. The images they captured were broadcast around the world, revealing the true scale of the disaster, a scene of utter destruction. Poor weather delayed progress until the afternoon of the 2nd of December. When the crash site was thoroughly examined for the first time, it quickly became clear that Flight 901 had collided with the 30-degree steep mountainside at high speed. The immense forces of the impact tore the aircraft apart. The fuel in the tanks ignited, causing an explosion. Twisted metal, charred debris, human remains and personal belongings were scattered over a length of more than 1,800 feet. Of the aircraft, only part of the tail section and a portion of the cabin directly above the wings were recognizable. The impact and the fire had destroyed almost everything. By the time the wreckage was discovered, the fire had already burned out on its own. The men tasked with the gruesome job of recovering human remains and evidence faced a situation no amount of training could have ever prepared them for. There is a documentary completely dedicated to the operation at the crash site, which delves into the stories of these brave men in particular. Feel free to watch this video after finishing this one. For anyone who wants to dive deeper into the tragedy, I highly recommend it. A link can be found below in the video description. The recovery team set up a small tent camp at the edge of the crash site and had to endure the harsh Antarctic weather. The terrain was riddled with deep crevasses where a single misstep could have proven fatal. Within a few hours on the first day, the black boxes critical to the investigation were already recovered. The flight data recorder logs key technical parameters of the aircraft, while the cockpit voice recorder stores the last 30 minutes of conversations in the cockpit. Both were essential for uncovering the cause of the disaster. Among the findings at the crash site was the intact body of Captain Jim Collins lying in the snow. Not far from him, the teams found his black ringbinder notebook. Inside were nearly pristine notes related to the flight preparations, which would later become key evidence. This unassuming notebook would eventually turn into a crucial piece of evidence, exposing controversial actions and challenging Air New Zealand's claims of innocence. Meanwhile, all evidence and the victims' remains were transported by helicopter to McMurdo Station and subsequently to New Zealand. As more details from the crash site surfaced and the search for potential causes intensified, a shocking revelation came to light. On the night before the tragic flight, the flight plan had been altered. The course from checkpoint Cape Hallett had been shifted by 2 degrees. However, a critical error occurred during the input of these new coordinates into the flight planning system by Air New Zealand's navigation department. The waypoint was entered incorrectly, resulting in a shift in the route. Alarmingly, this change redirected Flight 901 not to McMurdo Sound, as originally intended, but 27 miles east, directly toward Lewis Bay and on a collision course with Mount Erebus. Even more disturbingly, the crew was never informed of this course correction. When the question of blame arose, Air New Zealand quickly pointed the finger at the crew. The first investigation report, authored by Ron Chippendale and published on June 19, 1980, placed full responsibility for the crash on the pilots, particularly Captain Collins.
The crew were not monitoring their actual position in relation to the topography adequately.
Air New Zealand and the investigators argued that the crew should never have descended below 16,000 feet, a minimum altitude emphasized during briefings. However, this report triggered outrage among the public. Many New Zealanders refused to believe that the crew was solely responsible. Some Air New Zealand pilots who had attended the same briefings as Captain Collins were equally outraged. In response to public pressure, a second inquiry was launched just a month after the Chippendale report was released. This public inquiry, led by Justice Peter Mahan, revealed serious allegations against Air New Zealand. The airline had attempted to destroy large quantities of evidence shortly after the crash. Numerous documents that could have aided the investigation were shredded or went missing. Furthermore, the airline knew just hours after the crash about the erroneous course correction, but worked to conceal this mistake. 2 weeks after the disaster, a whistleblower exposed the truth to the press, breaking the airline's silence. Mahan uncovered other suspicious incidents. Shortly after the crash, Captain Collins's home was burglarized. While valuables were left untouched, documents related to Flight 901 vanished. Similarly, an Air New Zealand representative gained unauthorized access to First Officer Gregory Cassin's home and removed flight-related documents. Cassin's widow was unaware of this at the time and was shocked when she found out. These documents were never seen again. Such actions only strengthened Mahan's belief that Air New Zealand had something to hide. The evidence against the airline mounted, pushing it further into a corner. The final straw for Mahan came when Captain Collins's notebook was presented as evidence, only for its pages to be missing, with no explanation as to their whereabouts. Mahan also determined that Air New Zealand not only knew about the risky flight practices, but actively encouraged them. Crews routinely flew below the 16,000-foot guideline to offer passengers the best possible views, fulfilling the airline's marketing promises. This was an open secret, even highlighted in promotional materials. The CEO of Douglas Aircraft, the manufacturer of the DC-10, had once participated in one of these flights and wrote an article praising the views from 3,000 feet. A piece that was later printed 1 million times in Air New Zealand brochures and distributed nationwide. Mahan refuted the argument that the crew should never have flown as low as they did on that fateful day. In reality, there was no fixed minimum altitude, provided McMurdo Station cleared the descent and weather conditions allowed it. By April 1981, Mahon had reached his final conclusion, a verdict that sent shockwaves through the aviation industry.
Television New Zealand News with Philip Sherry.
Good evening. The report of the Royal Commission of Inquiry into the DC-10 disaster in Antarctica has finally been released. Mr. Justice Mahon says neither Captain James Collins nor First Officer Gregory Casson made any error which contributed to the crash. He concludes that the single dominant and effective cause was the mistake by airline officials who programmed the aircraft to fly directly at Mount Erebus and omitted to tell the air crew. And in a section highly critical of the airline management, he talks of a predetermined plan of deception at the inquiry. It was, he said, an attempt to conceal a series of disastrous administrative blunders. I am forced reluctantly to say, Mr. Justice Mahon says, that I had to listen to an orchestrated litany of lies. He also refers to the disappearance of documents taken by an airline employee from the home of the first officer. They were destroyed as irrelevant. A most remarkable decision, the judge says.
He accused Air New Zealand of deliberately destroying evidence and obstructing access to critical materials. The missing pages from Captain Collins's notebook, the break-ins where key documents vanished, and the mass shredding of paperwork at the airline's headquarters all significantly influenced Mahon's findings. Ultimately, the tragedy was caused by a fatal combination of misinformation, specific weather conditions, and deliberate deception. The question of why the crew failed to see the massive mountain despite seemingly clear visibility was also answered during specialized studies at the crash site. Sector whiteout conditions. These unique weather phenomena occur when snow-covered terrain and clouds blend seamlessly, making it impossible to discern the horizon or identify landmarks. The summit of Mount Erebus disappeared into a cloud layer, and the view ahead resembled the approach to McMurdo Sound. When the ground proximity warning system suddenly sounded, the crew had only seconds to act, too little time to save the aircraft. But the story of Flight 901 was far from over. Air New Zealand appealed Mahon's verdict, and he faced intense backlash, even from government officials. Justice Peter Mahon came under significant pressure after delivering his findings. His statement about an orchestrated litany of lies was dismissed by the New Zealand Court of Appeal and the Privy Council in London, as it went beyond the scope of an objective investigation. Though not officially dismissed, the immense political and societal pressure forced Mahon to resign. Shortly after his resignation, Air New Zealand terminated 12 employees implicated in the scandal. CEO Maury Davis initially declared he would continue in his role despite the findings, but retired just days later. After prolonged and deceptive investigations, Air New Zealand promised to ensure such a mistake would never happen again. However, just 13 months after the Erebus disaster, another incident occurred. On December 4, 1980, an error in flight planning for a route from New Zealand to Rarotonga resulted in insufficient fuel being allocated for the journey. Fortunately, the mistake was discovered in time and corrected. Like November 28, 1979, it was a seemingly small error with the potential for catastrophic consequences. Since the Erebus disaster, however, Air New Zealand has not experienced another fatal accident. The airline has since transformed, becoming one of the safest in the world. It has also re-evaluated its actions during the Erebus tragedy and taken responsibility for its past failures. In December 2019, shortly after the 40th anniversary of the disaster, the New Zealand government and the management of Air New Zealand formally apologised for their handling of the incident. They exonerated the crew and took full responsibility for the tragedy.
And the time has come to end piecemeal acknowledgements. After 40 years, on behalf of today's government, the time has come to apologise for the actions of an airline, then in full state ownership, which ultimately caused the loss of the aircraft and the loss of those you loved. This apology is wholehearted and wide-reaching. We will never know your grief, but I know the time has come to say I'm sorry.
I apologise on behalf of an airline which 40 years ago failed in its duty of care to its passengers and staff. And I apologise again on behalf of the airline for the way in which the families of those lost on Mount Erebus were treated in the aftermath of the incident.
Even though 45 years have passed since that day, which has etched itself into the history of aviation in New Zealand like a solemn memorial, this tragedy remains unforgettable for many. The tragedy of Flight 901 and its aftermath unfolded over 40 long years, becoming one of the greatest controversies in New Zealand's history. Although Air New Zealand and the New Zealand government have since taken responsibility for their past mistakes, the tragic events were overshadowed by lies, cover-ups, and reckless blame. Among the many victims of this tragedy was the reputation of the crew, particularly Captain Jim Collins. As it was later revealed, he and his crew were unjustly made scapegoats. Yet, there was one man who stood against this wrongdoing: Justice Peter Mahon, a judge who pierced through the veil of deception and refused to settle for the easiest explanation. Through his inquiry, he not only uncovered the truth, but fought for the honour and justice of those who could no longer defend themselves. This fight ultimately cost him his career. His Erebus inquiry was never officially recognised. However, in 2008, Mahon was posthumously awarded the Jim Collins Memorial Award, a late acknowledgement of his relentless pursuit of truth and a quiet validation of his findings. Justice Peter Mahon passed away in 1986, just a few years after the disaster. The tragedy left not only political and societal scars, but also deeply personal ones. The men sent into the eternal ice to search the crash site faced unspeakable horrors. They battled the harsh conditions of Antarctica, enduring exhaustion, freezing temperatures, and the unforgettable sight of death and destruction. Their effort was a sacrifice to ensure that such a tragedy would never happen again, and their contribution was also acknowledged far too late. In 2007, nearly 3 decades after the disaster, the recovery teams from Operation Overdue were awarded the Special Service Medal. For many of them, this gesture was not only a great honour, but also a pivotal step in finding closure, a moment of overdue but well-deserved respect. But the greatest suffering fell upon the victims' families, ordinary people who lost parents, children, siblings, spouses, or friends. For them, Flight 901 was more than just a number in the record books. It was a painful rupture in their lives that probably will take a toll on them for the rest of their days. At the time of the crash, it was the 4th largest disaster in aviation history. But decades of further tragedies in aviation have shifted its place. Today, it ranks as the 16th largest, yet it remains the deadliest disaster in New Zealand's history during peacetime. Of the 257 victims, 214 were ultimately identified. Near the crash site, a cross was erected, a silent memorial to honour the lives lost on that fateful day. To this day, the wreckage of the DC-10 lies in the same spot where it struck the mountain 45 years ago. Buried under snow and ice, it will likely remain there for many decades, or even centuries, a mute witness, an icy monument in the desolation of Antarctica, and a reminder of the 257 lives lost aboard Flight 901.